Hi everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar, Live Winners Announcement and Tearsheet Review. Today's speaker is Dr. Thomas Wiecki. Thomas Wiecki is the VP of Data Science at Quantopian. He did his Ph.D. at Brown University building computational models of the brain. He is the co-author of the popular probabilistic programming package PyMC3. Thank you, Thomas.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us for this live tearsheet review. We are really excited about all the submissions we have gotten for this new tearsheet challenge on the estimates dataset. Overall, there have been 44 submissions and we really enjoyed all of them. What I hope we could do here is go over a couple of them that are illustrative or just look really good and, of course, announce the winners. Towards the end, I also want to show how we use these and sort of what the next step would be when actually constructing these. As I outlined before, the requirements of the contest were basically to use the estimates dataset and submit a factor according to the new rules or guidelines that we have put out in the last couple of weeks using the new AlphaLens tearsheet that we also posted recently. The first tearsheet that I'm going to look at is that of Veridian Hawk. And that was one of the earliest submissions and one that I think is illustrative to look at. So here you can see that there's actually some good first day alpha, an IRR of 2. And then you can see what is often happening, that there is decay over the next couple of days, right? So here we have nice specific and total returns on this first day that then on the next day drop significantly, stays somewhat constant for the next 7 days, and then drops here. So usually the first thing that I would look at is this plot, just how high is it in the beginning and how fast does it drop. Then over here we have a very similar type of analysis where we're just looking at the cumulative returns of the total returns in the top row and the specific returns in the bottom row. The lines and colors indicate which delay we are running this with. So you can see that the first, the blue line refers to 1 day delay trading, so to this bar on the left here, and the second to the second day, so it's days 1 to 4. We didn't extend it out further than this, so here you can see the whole profile up until 14 days, just to keep things nice and visible here. And you can see that with a 1 day delay, this factor looks pretty good over the time period that it was submitted over. Here actually you can see that this was also submitted over a different time period than what we set in the contest criteria to set in the challenge criteria. Then down here we have the view of the exposures of the factor across time. So this is essentially a bar plot or a box plot where we have for the different risk factors in our risk model, things like volatility and also industry sectors down here. And here we would look at whether there are consistent biases that shift the factor attribution to one side or the other. Here you can see that pretty much all centered close to 0, which is good. And some of those have more variability than others, which means that there is some type of factor timing going on. And then, of course, momentum here actually does have a positive exposure. And that is something that is very common with especially this estimates type of factor, that it's very easy to pick up momentum exposure because the people who are creating these estimates are also biased by things that have gone up. So it's very easy to pick that up. I'm not going to go through like the full detail, but this is just like basically what I'm going to look for in these other tearsheets, and so that we all know what these different plots mean. Then here we have the cumulative returns. And here I'm just looking at where do the returns come from in this strategy. So the total returns are basically what is there in sum. And then we deconstructing in terms of the risk. And here we can say, okay, most of those total returns are specific returns and very little common returns down here. So this looks really good in this regard. And then basically there's no other real strong factor timing effects that have contributed significantly to the total cumulative returns. Over here we have a similar view, but instead of cumulative returns, we're looking at annual volatility, which is essentially how much of the total risk of the strategy is contributed by these different factors. So we see, okay, the total annualized volatility is around 5%, and 4% of those are specific returns. Again, this is really good and means that most of the risk is coming from, it's not coming from known risk factors in our model. So this is basically just like, how unique is it? And again, something that we have said before is you should not really try to actively use the optimizer or other things to squash these exposure to be exactly zero or normalize it to just be very low. It is totally okay for factors to have these exposures. So it's not really a problem for you to fix, but rather it is something for you to understand how your strategy works and where and how unique it is. Down here we have two plots in one. The first one is the number of holdings. So here we can see it's about 800 on average. The QTU goes up to 2,000, so there is some universe restriction filter that was put in. But actually 800 is a pretty solid number, so this looks good. And turnover, however, you can see is really high. It's capped, so I assume there is some turnover filter or limit placed on the optimizer to sort of limit it to not more than 65%. So the factor will probably want to have even higher turnover, but it's just dampened by the optimizer. So this is really probably the most problematic piece, the most problematic part of this factor is just that the turnover is too high. And then next here, we see the different quantiles of the tearsheet, the different quantiles of the holdings of the algorithm. And what we're looking for here is basically how nice is the spread of the positions. If you had a portfolio that was equal weighted, then the 5th percentile of your holdings, so your short side of your holdings, will almost certainly overlap or be very close to the 25th percentile. So what that means is there's no range to your factor scores or to your portfolio holdings. So they're all the same value. Ideally, what we want is that there's some gradation, some sensitivity to the factor represented in your holdings, because that essentially tells us that you are taking meaningful bets where if your alpha's forecast for a particular stock is very strong, then you want that represented in your holdings as receiving a very high weight, versus if the signal is weak, we would expect it to get a low weight. And equal weighting gets rid of that. And this looks very similar, very close to equal weighting actually, where like these two are very close to the median line in red here. So either like both of those would be up, or just all three of them would be at the center. So this is somewhat problematic, where there is most of the weights just being very similar to each other. So that is what each of those subplots mean, and we now can just look forward. So yeah, in summary, this one I enjoyed, but you can see some of those problems, like the alpha decay is pretty high, the turnover is very high, and also the holdings are not really all that nicely spread out. However, Veridian Hawk submitted next tearsheet where we can see that he fixed a lot of those, or maybe it's a totally different submission, so I don't know, but this one actually looks way better in many regards. First thing we can see is that the alpha decay profile looks way better. So it starts about the same, actually a little bit lower than the previous one, but it stays way more constant. So this we like to see much more than something that like starts high but then drops significantly. So there's almost no alpha decay here, and the returns here, now it's also over the correct time period. You can see that this is a bit more choppy early on. But nonetheless, like for this IR, that's sort of what you would expect, but there's no huge drawdown over this period. So this looks pretty good. And then again, we see that we have this momentum exposure, something that we will see a lot. As I said before, it's just difficult to have factors that don't have that. But again, it's not really a problem. It just tells you, okay, this is, my factor is correlated to this. And depending on how strong it is, that would be the only point at which you might want to revise your factor, is like, if most of your returns are coming from common returns, what it tells you is, well, what you found is not really all that unique and thus not all that interesting. But that's really about it. So again, it's not something to get rid of, it's just something to understand. Now the number of holdings are still fairly high. That's pretty good. And the turnover is now also much better controlled. So it's not coming up to some crazy limit, but rather on good days, it's 5% and going up to 20, 25. So this would be totally in line. Here again, we can see a little bit of a problem with the sensitivity of the holdings. So again, we have the 5th and the 95th percentile of the portfolio weights over time being very far away from the other one. So actually, to say that a better way is that the 75th and the 25th percentile in green and in purple are very close to 0 and to the medium holdings. So what this tells me again is this is very close to equal weighted. So there's no sensitivity in small values and there's only large values essentially, and they're all the same. So this would probably be the biggest problem with this strategy. But overall, I think this looks really interesting. And the RR is not crazy high, but nonetheless, it has a little decay. So this is one I really like, and especially also thank you, Veridian Hawk, for posting both of these, where you can really see the progression and sort of where the quant learned something and built that into the strategy. This next one is by Daniel Castillo, and it is an example of something that made it almost across the finish line. So you can already see, like, okay, it has really nice IR in the first days that then decays, but I mean, that's just normal, right? But there is definitely some pretty sharp decay here. And this looks very cool, the cumulative returns. So there's no real, just nice and steady over time. The specific cumulative returns, this looks really good. Again, we can see the momentum tilt. What I really liked about this one is the turnover is pretty steady, around 10%. That's awesome. And the number of holdings are very high. So this is probably just almost across the whole QTU. So that makes it really valuable factor, where we can now take this factor and include it in many different ways and really work with it. And now we can also see the difference to the previous tear sheet down here, where now these two lines, the purple, the 75th percentile, and the 25th percentile green line, are nice and separated from 0, and the median line in red. So this shows, okay, we actually have a nice distribution in weights where there are small values and large values, and they mean something different, and large values represent a stronger signal than small values. Here's one from Andy, which also quite liked. Just looking at this, we can again see, okay, the alpha decay profile is quite nice. Again, there is definitely some decay, but overall, it is competitive. So this one also made it close. And the number of holdings are really high. The turnover does spike to 30%. So one thought might be to maybe apply moving average to the factor value. Maybe that helps to smooth these out a little bit, but of course, this will also be just driven by when the underlying scores that your factor is derived on are changing. This actually here looks a little bit problematic. Like, I don't know what is going on with this spike. So this seems to be some problem in the allocation, or maybe the factor, some outlier values driving this. And we can also see that the holdings drop at the same time. So, this indicates some, maybe even a data problem, or I don't know what, but it looks weird, and it's something that I would advise Andy to go in and look for, to fix. And actually, he does have another submission that looks better than this, where he did fix this. So, it's fine. I just thought this was going to be illustrative. Moving on, this is another good example from Vasilius Nico Lau. Here, there is almost no alpha decay, which is really good. It's mostly flat in the first 2 years, but then picks up. So that's okay. Then it has like fairly strong negative value component. The contribution of, in general, the common returns is low, so it's not really all that concerning, just something to note. And again, we have the long momentum exposure. The main problems, though, are that the number of holdings is low. So 80 holdings is quite low compared to other ones. It's just a fraction of the QTU. The turnover looks nice. And again, we can see this is essentially just equally weighted, even stronger than the other one. So there's just 3 lines, because here the 25th and the 5th percentile, so the green and the blue line, are just completely overlapping. So this is just equal weighted the whole way through. And this can easily happen, even if you don't intend it to happen, when you have constraints in the optimizer that are squashing your weights in a certain way. So depending on how you set your weights, and maybe your turnover or position limits or minimum allocation sizes, maximum allocation sizes, you might force the optimizer into a corner where it says, okay, well, the only way to really meet those constraints is to equal weight everything. And that's something that you don't want, because you're removing the sensitivity that is present in your factor from the holdings. And as I mentioned in my post earlier, the holdings is what we're looking for. The end of day holdings is what we're looking for, and essentially using that as a proxy for your factor value that we want to infer that way. So we prefer the mapping function going from your factor to the portfolio to be as linear as possible. And that's why we keep stressing the point that you should not place any constraints really in the optimizer, because that will just change things and make it look weird to the end. And this is one example of those. Nonetheless, it's a great contribution. So thank you so much for the submission. Okay, so now we come to Kyla N, and this one looks great in almost every respect. So it has more alpha than we've seen in any of the previous ones. Mostly specific returns, so those are even higher. Very little decay, so it just after 5 days drops around under 2.5. So that's amazing. This looks great. Again, we have here now a long size tilt, but again, I'm not totally worried about this, because the returns are still driven mainly by specific returns. And one other reason, just as an aside here, why we don't really care too much about the exposures and why they shouldn't just all be zero is, and we will see this later too, when we start averaging these factors together, a lot of those exposures naturally just average out. So if, for example, this argument here has a long size tilt, that does not mean that this will actually make it through to the combined factors that we then put together when we're constructing the portfolio, because there will be some in there that have a short size tilt, and those two will naturally cancel each other out. This has a lot of holdings, which is great, and the turnover is, on good days, just a bit higher than 5%, and then spiking up to 20%, so totally in line. And here you can also see nice separation of the weights of the strategy. So this is actually just almost picture perfect, and it's the first winner of the contest. So Kyla, congratulations. you won this estimates challenge. Moving on, we have Leo M, also with a really strong submission. The first look always goes to the upper left corner. We see that we have a really nice profile. There's almost no alpha decay, and the alpha is not as high as the previous one, but nonetheless it's in the ballpark. Maybe some small choppiness in the returns here, but not too worrisome. The exposures definitely are more variable over time, so maybe there's some factor timing also going on, which is also what we can now see here, where the common returns are actually contributing, not a lot, but a little bit, so it doesn't seem too crazy, but actually there's a lot of volatility coming from common returns, and also some positive cumulative returns from a technology exposure that we see here. So again, it's not really overly problematic, but nonetheless, it degrades what I would expect we can get out of this signal once we combine it with other ones. Here we can see that the number of holdings seems to have been capped at 500. So that would then raise the question for me is, well, why was it capped at 500 and not 800 or 1,000? Does it stop working there? And so that this is one way to like make it look the best, which might be a form of overfitting. It doesn't have to be, but nonetheless, ideally the universe size would be larger here. And we can see the turnover is actually really nice. So I'm not quite sure what's going on here. So that is something that I would drill in deeper. That would be my feedback. But overall, like 5% is really great. And also the holdings here look picture perfect. So this looks like it would just come from a really nice normal distribution of weights over time that is pretty steady. So this looks great. Thanks so much for your submission, Leo. Moving on, we have a tearsheet by Anthony Jackson. Again, this is one that looks really good. We can see that the alpha is high on the first day and stays high, like very little decay, just drops under 2 after day 7. That is really strong. And the exposures are all centered around 0. I wonder if this is just the natural factors underlying this, or if there was some risk control over on top of this. That is fine. Nonetheless, I would be interested in seeing it, how it looks like if without any risk control, if that was even done here. I don't know. Like, it's also possible that the factor combination makes it basically averages out those exposures so that the final result will end up looking like this. But this is also really cool. Most of the returns come from specific returns. Great. Turnover is a little bit higher. It's 10% and has quite a few spikes that make it look up. So here, maybe that could be controlled in a better way, maybe with the moving average, but not too worrisome. The number of holdings is really high, so I think this is really just tracking the QTU, so that's amazing. That gives a lot of breadth to this factor, and we can also see that the weights are nice and have a nice distribution with all kinds of different sensitivities. And because of the quality of this factor, Anthony Jackson is our second winner. So amazing. Congratulations, Anthony. This next one is from Vladimir, and it's also one of the really strong ones. You can see that the alpha profile is, again, picture perfect. It just stays high over time. The exposures are really low. Again, I would wonder if there was risk management being done, but taking that aside, the turnover is low. Again, we have these spikes that is probably just also going to be driven by the factors, but so that's that is also not prohibitive, so that looks good. And also we can see some variability here. Maybe also these two lines, the 25th and the 75th percentile, are a little bit close. That could be something that could be tweaked, but nonetheless, overall, a very impressive contribution and also prizeworthy. So Vladimir, congratulations, you are one of the winners. So I'm going to skip this one. So this submission by Shiv Chala, I hope I'm saying that correctly, is really interesting because on first look, it looks really cool. It has a nice profile and the returns, cumulative returns, look great. Here we see again, like with another submission by Kyla N, I think, or I think it was someone else. But anyway, that there's long tech exposure and that is contributing a lot of risk and also some cumulative returns. So that is one thing that we would essentially look more closely at how much we would get out of this in if the factor was combined with other ones. But then here we see, okay, the number of holdings isn't that high, and also there's some problem with the weights here where it sort of drifts into equal weighting with only little variability. So this is basically what rules the strategy out, even though it looks really promising. But Shiv followed up with this with another submission, and we can see how that was improved, or maybe it was a different submission, I don't know. But either way, this one really, Shiv was able to remedy those weak points and make another really strong submission where now the alpha profile is even stronger, so it never dips below 2.5. That's really impressive. The exposures now also look much cleaner. The tech long exposure is still there, but it's much smaller, and it doesn't really contribute much risk or cumulative returns, so they're all being driven by specific returns. The number of holdings now are also way higher, which is great. The turnover is way lower in this submission as well, and this looks even cleaner than before. So again, I completely love this submission, and it is also prizeworthy. So congratulations, Shiv Chala. You are one of the winners of the Estimates Challenge. So then, coming to the end here, this is a submission that made it really close from Vladimir. Vladimir already won for this other tear sheet, but this one also looked really good. It might be a similar submission. I did not check it for this one. But yeah, this is another great one, and we see the turnover spikes, but nonetheless, this one looked great. And last but not least, this is by Ruslan, and it is pretty remarkable. So we can see that actually the alpha profile is higher than any of the other submissions, right? It starts out near 5 and then stays pretty constant around 3, which is phenomenal. The exposures look pretty clean, and they sort of look natural. So I don't really see any evidence that it was constrained in any way. So it just seems like it is the raw factor expression that we're seeing here. And the number of holdings is really high. The turnover is really nicely controlled. We have nice variability down here. So of all of the submissions, this is the strongest one, and it wins the first prize of this. So congratulations, Vedran. Really impressive submission. I really enjoyed this one. So those are our 5 winners. And next, what I wanted to show is the next step in what we would do with this. So here's a Jupyter notebook where I ran these factors now reran them on our own infrastructure. So there we can run it out of sample as well. So I reran them and then loaded them into our own private research server. And we can see that the first thing I checked is I load them in and I just check for the QTU coverage. So they all are trading stocks in the QTU. The next thing I looked at were the correlations, just to see how similar are these. And we can see that Anthony Jackson and Shiv Chala, sorry, there's a typo in what I wrote here. Apologies. Are really uncorrelated, so that's awesome. And Kyla and Vladimir are the most correlated, but not that high, around 0.5, which is not nothing, but it's still in line. It doesn't cross a boundary, but overall, this looks pretty good, especially these two submissions. Then here now I regenerate them over the out of sample as well. So we ran this on the out of sample, and I thought that was really interesting because we do see some differences here. So this is the factor by Anthony Jackson. We can see that it still does well in the submission, but then is flat in the out of sample. This does not have to mean that there's overfitting going on, because like markets change, right? These factors might be more susceptible to regimes in this time period, but it is just something to look out for and monitor closely. So yeah, that is something that we will keep on the lookout for, but nonetheless, it holds up well here. Kyla N's factor, you can see, just really stays strong even in the out of sample, so that is really impressive. Overall, it looks even stronger than the submission. And Ruslan's also extremely impressive. Just basically just what we saw before, so it holds up quite well. Ship's submission, we can see it sort of gets a little flat here, so that's something to keep monitoring. And Vladimir is still going up. So then, and this is really, I think, where hopefully it'll click for like our new approach is, what I did is combine all of these factors together now. So I'm just saying, okay, throwing all of those factors together gives me a new combined factor. And what does that look like? So this is what the combined factor looks like. So it has more alpha than all of the individual ones and really slow decay. So this is like incredible and just like a straight line up, even in the out of sample, right? So this is also why it's nice, is to have some hedging of bets essentially against overfitting by just combining many of them. The exposures average out over time, so that is really strong. So there's just all specific returns. That is what I mentioned before, why we're not all that concerned that every individual factor can't have any exposures, because when you combine them together, they just average out. And then also we have now a really wide portfolio. That does not mean that we will necessarily trade all of these, but we have a lot to work with from this factor, where we can now constrain risk, maybe constrain turnover, even though it's fine here, maybe only trade into the positions that have the highest alpha. So this gives us a lot to work with. Okay, so that is essentially those things. And the last thing that I want to say, and then I don't know if we can take questions, but the last thing is that we love these submissions, the winning submissions so much that we want to license each of those 5. So expect license agreements being sent to you, and we hope that you accept, because you really made outstanding contributions. But that is true across the board. So we were extremely excited about all these submissions that we received. They all look really strong. And for those that didn't receive a prize, and hopefully were able to learn maybe some of the things that we're looking for, and now have an idea for how to fix these, what we're going to do is we'll have a new thread, Estimates Challenge Redux, if you want, where you can post your updated factors where you might fix some of the issues that are outlined here and can then still receive an allocation. So we definitely invite you to go back to those factors, maybe fix the holdings issue or turnover or whatever I highlighted or you think could be improved, post it there, and I'm more than happy to take a new look at them and hopefully license more strategies.
Yeah, we can take questions if you want.
Okay.
But there's currently no questions. So.
Okay, fantastic then. So yeah, you can either type your questions in the chat now, or you can type them on the thread where the winners were announced. But other than that, thank you so much for tuning in. Congratulations to the winners, and look forward to the next challenge, which will come soon.